So, you made it through part one. Congratulations! You've survived the swamps, the weird kings, the land grabs, slave revolts, and a republic that claimed to be for the people, but somehow forgot who the people actually were. And you thought that was the end? Not even close, my friend. That was just the opening act. Part 2 is when Roman history switches to full political drama mode. The rebels start writing poetry. The heroes are drowning in debt and making deals with pirates. And the glorious republic, it starts sliding toward men in togas who smile in public and carry knives in private. But before we dive in, a quick question. Where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Not just asking for fun, because in ancient Rome, time was everything. Pick the wrong hour, and your trial could be canceled. Marry on the wrong day, the gods might curse your goats and your inheritance. So, if you're listening at 11:11 p.m., lights low, room a little too quiet, congratulations. You're in exactly the right vibe for what's coming next. Grab a pillow. Wrap yourself in a blanket. Turn the lights down, because tonight's story begins with a teenager nobody noticed, a boy who quietly survived Sulla's blood-stained purge, who once got kidnapped by pirates and used the time to practice public speaking like it was a live stream warm-up. Nobody thought he'd amount to much, and yet, that boy was Julius Caesar.
A silent teenager, Julius Caesar watches everything. Sulla had stepped down, the blood had stopped flowing in the streets, but the Republic was still bleeding on the inside. Rome had survived its first dictatorship, but it hadn't healed. It had learned to flinch at names whispered in the Forum, to obey power cloaked in legality, and to accept the terrifying new reality that Rome could be conquered by Romans. In this uneasy silence, as the Senate limped back into ritual and the people looked for something to believe in again, a boy watched. He was too young to command legions, too poor to bribe votes, and too connected to all the wrong names. But he listened, he remembered, and he waited. Caesar escapes Sulla's purge. That should have been the end of his story. Gaius Julius Caesar was 16 years old when the world nearly closed in around him. His family was noble, but not powerful. What made him dangerous in Sulla's eyes wasn't what he had done, but who he was. His aunt had married Gaius Marius. He had married Cornelia, daughter of Cinna, a leading figure of the Marian faction. Sulla didn't need more evidence. Caesar was marked. First, his inheritance was revoked. Then his religious title, Flamen Dialis, priest of Jupiter, was stripped from him. Finally, the order came: divorce Cornelia or face death. Caesar refused, and that refusal made him a fugitive in his own city. He fled into hiding, moving between safe houses across the countryside. Some accounts say he was caught and bribed his captors. Others claim sympathetic allies, perhaps even the Vestal Virgins, intervened. What matters is that he survived, not by luck, but by a razor-thin thread of connections and resolve. When he was finally spared, Sulla offered no warmth. He is said to have remarked, "Let him live, for now." In that boy, there are many Mariuses. It wasn't mercy. It was a warning. And Caesar understood exactly what it meant. So he returned to Rome, stripped of power, reputation, and resources. But what he carried was more valuable than any office: an understanding of how the Republic now worked. He had seen the rules broken, rewritten, and weaponized. He had witnessed up close the machinery of tyranny disguised as reform. Most of all, he had seen how quickly a name could get you killed and how silence could save you. So he stayed quiet. He didn't try to reclaim his priesthood. He didn't challenge the Senate. Instead, he began to learn. He watched the orators in the forum, memorizing cadence and crowd control. He studied law, not to defend anyone, but to master the mechanics of persuasion. He observed how deals were made behind temple walls, how favors circulated like currency, how weakness wore a smile. He had been spared not because he was harmless, but because he was underestimated. That would not happen again. The Republic had taught Caesar its darkest truths, that violence could be legal, that politics was theater, and that loyalty mattered more than law. These were not lessons for an idealist. They were lessons for someone patient enough to play a longer game. Caesar understood. He would not speak loudly, not yet. He would not stand out, yet. He would move carefully, speak sweetly, and build something far more dangerous than a protest. He would build a future. And one day, Rome would offer him the very thing it had once tried to take. Everything.
Pirates, oratory, and debt. Before he ever wore a laurel wreath, Caesar wore chains. After the terror of Sulla, Caesar left Rome. With no title, no fortune, and few friends, he sought both distance and purpose. He served in the East on military assignment in Asia Minor, where he distinguished himself in battle and diplomacy. There, he began to taste the edge of leadership and its price. His first public honor came during the siege of Mytilene, where he fought with such bravery that he was awarded the Civic Crown, one of the Republic's highest military decorations. It was not power, but it was a beginning. Then came the pirates. En route across the Aegean, Caesar was captured by Silesian pirates and held for ransom. They demanded 20 talents. He laughed in their faces, insulted. "You clearly don't know who you've captured," he said. "Ask for 50. They did. While waiting for the ransom, Caesar lived among them, unfazed, even amused. He told them stories. He composed speeches. He joined in their games. And he joked again and again that once freed, he would return and crucify them all. They laughed, brave. He didn't. When the money arrived, Caesar was released. He immediately raised a small fleet, hunted the pirates down, captured them, and kept his promise: crucifixion. But first, in what he would call an act of mercy, he had their throats cut. Not because he forgave them, because he wanted to control how they died. It was Caesar in miniature, charming, intelligent, lethal, a man who could entertain you one day and execute you the next, and more importantly, a man who could make justice look like a performance. When he returned to Rome, Caesar carried no gold, but he carried a name that was beginning to matter. He traveled to Rhodes, where he studied under Apollonius Milan, one of the finest rhetorical instructors in the Greek world. There, Caesar refined what would become one of his most devastating weapons: his voice. Molon taught him how to move a crowd, how to build rhythm and suspense, how to hold silence like a blade and time a pause like a punch. Caesar wasn't just learning to speak, he was learning to conquer without touching a sword. And yet Rome was expensive. Elections cost money, friends required favors. The public loved games, and the games cost fortunes. Caesar had none. But what he did have was nerve and an uncanny ability to borrow. He racked up staggering debts, making promises he couldn't yet fulfill, calling in loans with nothing but charm and potential. One of his biggest backers was Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Crassus didn't fund Caesar because he believed in him. He funded Caesar because he knew this man could move the masses, and that might one day make him useful. Caesar used that money to run for office, to stage public festivals, to keep his name always on the lips of the poor. He was never the richest candidate, but he was always the most unforgettable.
He wore his toga just a little looser than traditional allowed. He kept his hair combed forward in a signature fringe. He walked through the forum like a man who already belonged in the history books. And though he was often ridiculed by his opponents as feminine, arrogant, or untrustworthy, none of it stuck. Because every time he spoke, the crowd listened. Every time he appeared, people turned. And slowly the Republic began to realize this man might be dangerous. Not because he had wealth, but because he had a story, and he was learning how to make Rome believe it.
Building power through spectacle and crowds. Caesar understood one fundamental truth about the late Republic. Rome no longer believed in itself. The Senate had become a stage, the laws were weapons, and the people were hungry, not just for food, but for a figure who could fill the vacuum that the old Republic had left behind. Caesar didn't try to reform that system. He mastered it. He ran for the position of aedile, not the highest office, but one with a crucial responsibility, managing public games and infrastructure. While most candidates spent carefully, Caesar spent recklessly. He borrowed even more money. He imported exotic animals, staged unprecedented gladiator matches, flooded entire arenas to simulate naval battles. The costs were astronomical, the debt unspeakable, the message unforgettable. He didn't just entertain the people, he gave them theater, not in words, but in scale. He transformed his campaign into a spectacle of abundance, charisma, and controlled chaos. His name became inseparable from grandeur. Rome had seen competent administrators, now it saw something else, someone who made politics emotional. And the crowd responded. When Caesar walked through the streets, he didn't just draw attention, he created fervor. The poor cheered, the elite frowned, but even his enemies couldn't deny. This man had it, that strange, dangerous force that couldn't be bought or taught. Presence. He gave speeches laced with humor and idealism, promised restoration of Roman greatness, promised bread and games, promised subtly a return to dignity, if only they would let him rise a little higher. But every move was calculated. Caesar didn't just flatter the crowd, he organized them. He built networks of supporters, clubs, and informal street forces, gangs really, that could sway elections, intimidate rivals, and amplify his every gesture. He learned that a chant at the right time could matter more than a Senate vote, that an emotional audience could undo a cold legal argument, that in Rome's new politics, the crowd wasn't the backdrop, it was the engine. And through that engine, Caesar bypassed traditional ladders of power. He won elections others thought unwinnable. He gained offices he wasn't supposed to hold yet. He became indispensable, not because the Senate respected him, but because the people adored him. And fear followed adoration like a shadow. By the time he was elected Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, Caesar was still technically broke, but politically, he was rich in ways the Republic no longer knew how to measure. He wasn't speaking for the gods. He was speaking for Rome's future and shaping it in his image. And he had only just begun. Caesar versus Pompey. 1 republic, 2 ambitions. The crowds cheered louder, the debts grew deeper, and Caesar kept rising. By now, he wasn't just a politician, he was a movement. But the higher he climbed, the thinner the air, and the sharper the knives. Rome, at its core, still feared kings, but it feared instability more. And as the Senate lost its grip, it sought order in the most Roman way possible, by sharing power among the powerful. This is where ambition met its echo. The first triumvirate and the fracture beneath. Caesar had charisma and the love of the people, but no army. Pompey had military glory, loyal veterans, and vast eastern wealth, but no legislative finesse. Crassus had unimaginable riches and influence, but no heroic narrative. So they formed an alliance. It wasn't formal, it wasn't written, but it was absolute. The first triumvirate, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, was a backroom revolution. Together, they could bypass the Senate, control elections, distribute land, appoint allies, and silence critics. In theory, it was a balance of power. In practice, it was an agreement of convenience, held together by favors and tension. Caesar was granted a consulship. In it, he passed popular land laws, secured deals for his allies, and repaid political debts with interest. Then came his greatest reward, a military command in Gaul. It's supposed to be a footnote. It became a legend. Over the next decade, Caesar didn't just wage a campaign, he reshaped himself into something Rome had not seen since Sulla, but with far more precision. He conquered tribes, crushed rebellions, crossed into Britain, and wrote every triumph down in vivid third-person prose. The Commentari de Bello Gallico wasn't a war report, it was public relations, and Rome read it like gospel. Meanwhile, the alliance at home began to decay. Crassus, desperate for his own military glory, went east to fight the Parthians. He was killed at Carrhae. His head, some say, was used in a performance for a foreign king. Now back in Rome, Pompey was shifting. He had married Caesar's daughter, Julia, a bond of loyalty and blood. But after her death, there was no glue left. The Senate, always wary of Caesar's popularity, courted Pompey as a counterbalance. And slowly, the man who had once called Caesar ally began calling him threat. The balance was broken. The triumvirate was dead. And Rome was no longer big enough for both of them.
Crossing the Rubicon, no turning back. In January of 49 BCE, a single decision shattered 5 centuries of Roman tradition. It wasn't made in the Senate or at a sacred altar. It was made by a general, standing at the edge of a small river in northern Italy, the Rubicon. It was nothing spectacular, a shallow, unimpressive stream, but it marked the legal boundary between Caesar's province in Gaul and the city of Rome. Roman law was clear. No general could cross that river with an army. To do so was treason. To do so was civil war. Caesar stood at its banks and paused. He knew what lay ahead. If he crossed, he would be labeled an enemy of the state. If he turned back, he would be tried, humiliated, possibly executed. Because in his absence, Rome had turned on him. The Senate, increasingly under Pompey's influence, demanded Caesar surrender his army and return to face charges of illegal warfare and abuse of power. Caesar offered compromise. He would disband his army if Pompey did the same. The offer was refused. Caesar understood the game. The Senate didn't want balance. They wanted blood. So he looked at his men, veterans of a decade's worth of conquest, and said, "The die is cast." Then he crossed the Rubicon. The news hit Rome like lightning. Panic erupted. Senators fled the city. Pompey, unprepared for Caesar's speed, evacuated with the Senate to the south, then across the Adriatic to Greece. The city Caesar entered was not defended, but abandoned. He didn't sack it, he secured it. He declared himself the defender of the Roman people against a corrupt Senate manipulated by a jealous general. Then he went after Pompey. What followed was not just a civil war, it was a war for the meaning of Rome. Pompey had the Senate's blessing, the loyalty of many eastern provinces, and a strong navy. But Caesar had something else, momentum and narrative. He moved swiftly through Italy. Towns opened their gates, allies pledged support. He captured the treasury, restored order, presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Senate had claimed he would destroy the Republic. Instead, he looked like its last hope. In Greece, Pompey assembled a massive force, more men, more ships, more allies. He still had the advantage, but Caesar moved faster. He crossed the Adriatic in winter, with fewer troops, risking storms and starvation. When he landed, he was outnumbered, undersupplied, and surrounded. And yet, he advanced. Skirmishes followed, narrow escapes, strategic retreats. Then, in 48 BCE, came the showdown, the Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey's army was nearly twice the size. He had the high ground, the supply lines, and every reason to win. Caesar had exhausted troops and one final bet, that his men, bonded by years of hardship, would fight not for pay, but for him. They did. Against odds, Caesar's forces routed Pompey's army. Discipline, experience, and precision won over numbers. Pompey fled to Egypt. Caesar followed. But when he arrived, he was met with a shock. Pompey was dead, assassinated by Egyptian officials trying to win Caesar's favor. They presented him with Pompey's head, expecting thanks. Caesar did not thank them. He wept, not just for a rival lost, but for what had been broken. Pompey had been many things: ally, opponent, symbol of the old order. His death by foreign hands was an insult to Roman dignity. But Caesar didn't turn back. He turned deeper. In Egypt, he became embroiled in the country's own civil war between Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra. He backed her, fought a siege in Alexandria, won, and in the process began a legendary relationship that would shape not just personal gossip, but geopolitics. Meanwhile, Rome watched. The Senate had no power. The city had no direction. Caesar returned to Rome in triumph, declared dictator, then consul, then dictator again. The Republic, technically, still existed, but the Republic had no breath left. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon not just to win a war, but to reshape Rome itself. And that reshaping was almost complete.
From victory to death, the Ides of March. Caesar returned to Rome not as a conqueror, but as something stranger, an unstoppable force in a republic that still pretended it had rules. He was hailed as a hero, appointed dictator again, and then unprecedented, dictator for 10 years, then dictator for life. Rome, exhausted by war and chaos, accepted it. Some celebrated. After all, Caesar had restored order. He cut debt, settled veterans, reformed the calendar, expanded citizenship, passed laws, built buildings, pardoned enemies. But others watched warily. They had seen this script before: a man with too much power, a senate reduced to ritual, a city that cheered too easily, and one title that Rome was never meant to hear again: king. Caesar never claimed the title, but he wore the laurel crown constantly. His image appeared on coins, statues were raised. He sat on a golden chair in the Senate. Priests called him divine. He refused a crown once, publicly, offered by Mark Antony during a festival. He pushed it away. The crowd cheered, but many weren't convinced. It felt too choreographed, too theatrical, as if he wanted it, but wanted them to ask first. The idea of kingship hovered over Rome like a storm cloud, and in that shadow the knives were sharpened. The plot wasn't born of madmen. It came from senators, men who had once served with Caesar, dined with him, praised him: Brutus, Cassius, Casca, dozens more. They didn't agree on much, except this: If Caesar lived, the Republic would die. So they planned. The timing mattered. The optics mattered more. They chose the Senate meeting on the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BCE, a day heavy with ritual and symbolism. Caesar almost didn't go. He had been warned by friends, by his wife Calpurnia, who dreamed of blood, by a soothsayer who famously said, "Beware the Ides of March." But Caesar went anyway. He entered the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting temporarily. He walked in unarmed. The senators rose, smiled, surrounded him. Then the first blade struck. He turned. Another stabbed. Then another. It wasn't a quick kill. It was a frenzy. At least 60 men, 23 wounds, no guards, no escape. Legend says Caesar resisted at first, shouting, struggling, until he saw Brutus, his friend, perhaps his son. Then he stopped. "It too, Brute?" he asked, or so the story goes. Then he fell. At the base of a statue of Pompey, the man he had defeated to seize power. Blood pooled. The senators fled. Rome fell silent. The Republic, they thought, had been saved. They were wrong. The days that followed were confusion, not liberation. The conspirators had no plan. The people did not cheer. They mourned, rioted, carried Caesar's body through the streets weeping, burned the Senate house, praised his memory. He was dead, but he had already won, because Caesar hadn't just held power, he had redesigned it. His funeral became a rallying cry. His reforms remained, and his name, Caesar, became something no republic could contain. It would become a title, a system, an empire. And every ruler after him, whether in Rome, Russia, or Germany, would echo the same truth. A republic can die, not with a scream, but with an ovation.
The legacy of Caesar and the empire split in two. They killed the man, but not the movement. When the knives of the Ides of March were wiped clean, Brutus and Cassius believed they had restored the Republic. They thought the people would cheer, the Senate would regain its voice, and the traditions of old Rome would be reborn. They were wrong, because Caesar had already reshaped Rome, not just in politics, but in imagination. He had become more than a man. He was momentum, myth, inevitability, and the Republic no longer knew how to function without him. Brutus, Cassius, and the failure of an ideal. Brutus believed in the Republic. He had read the philosophers, revered the past. He thought Rome could still be a city of laws and balance. Cassius was more cynical, a soldier, realist, tactician. Together they led the conspiracy not for power, but for what they claimed was principle. But principle, in a vacuum, is a fragile thing. They had no army, no treasury, no plan for the aftermath. While Caesar had ruled through loyalty and spectacle, Brutus and Cassius ruled through absence, and Rome does not rally behind silence. At first, they tried speeches. They declared liberty restored. But the people didn't rejoice. They rioted. Caesar's will was read aloud, distributing wealth to the plebs, leaving parks to the people, naming his great-nephew Octavian as heir. The crowd wept. Then they burned the Senate house to the ground. Brutus and Cassius fled. They went east, raising legions in Macedonia and Syria, trying to build a liberator's army. But something had shifted. They weren't seen as defenders of freedom. They were seen as the men who had killed Caesar. And across the sea, his name was being sharpened into a weapon. Because two men, very different but bound by ambition, were preparing to claim what Caesar had left behind. One was a master of words, the other of presence, and both would soon learn you don't inherit a republic, you fight for its ashes.
Antony versus Octavian, the First Media War. After Caesar's death, there was no coronation, no orderly succession, just a vacuum, loud, dangerous, and ripe for claim. Two men stepped into it. Mark Antony, Caesar's closest ally and co-consul, was strong, experienced, a skilled orator with legions at his back and charisma in abundance. He had fought beside Caesar. He had spoken at his funeral. His speech had turned grief into fury and fury into flames. Many assumed he would inherit Caesar's power. But Caesar had left behind something more potent than loyalty, a name. And he had given it not to Antony, but to his great-nephew, Gaius Octavius, later known as Octavian. Just 19 years old, barely a man, no military experience, no authority, but he had one thing Antony didn't: legitimacy. In his will, Caesar had adopted Octavian as his son and heir. That made him Caesar's legal successor, and that meant everything. At first, Antony scoffed. Who was this boy? A student? A child? He tried to ignore him, sideline him, even intimidate him. But Octavian was not made of soft clay. He played the long game. He visited the legions Caesar had once commanded and called them not my soldiers, but Caesar's veterans. He paid them with borrowed money, called himself Caesar's son, and most of all, he made sure Rome knew his name. Posters, coins, speeches. Octavian didn't need to defeat Antony on the battlefield, not yet. He only needed to win the image war, and in this he was ruthless. He called Antony a traitor to Caesar's memory, accused him of hoarding power, of cozying up to Cleopatra, of abandoning Roman values for Egyptian luxuries. Meanwhile, Antony painted Octavian as a boy king, an opportunist, an untested manipulator hiding behind Caesar's shadow. The people watched and chose sides, but the Senate, ever opportunistic, chose both. It aligned briefly with Octavian to push Antony out of Rome, forcing him to flee east. The result? Temporary alliances, shifting loyalties, and, inevitably, another war. But this war would not be decided just by swords. It would be fought with symbols. Octavian understood that narrative was power, so he began crafting one. He positioned himself as the guardian of Caesar's legacy, the restorer of the Republic, the son of a god. Literally. After Caesar's posthumous deification by the Senate, Octavian began calling himself Divi Filius, son of the divine. It wasn't humility, it was branding. Antony, meanwhile, was doing something more dangerous, falling in love with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. Brilliant, manipulative, magnetic. Together they ruled not just in affection, but in strategy. Antony declared her children heirs to eastern territories. He dressed like a pharaoh, gave speeches in Alexandria, spoke of a new Rome, a Rome ruled from the east. To Octavian, this was a gift. He published Antony's will, stolen, forged, or leaked, revealing Antony's plans to leave Roman lands to his children with Cleopatra. The Senate was horrified, the public incensed. For Rome, it wasn't just betrayal, it was treason. Octavian didn't declare war on Antony. He declared war on Cleopatra. He framed it not as a civil war, but a war for Roman virtue against foreign decadence. He made Antony look like a puppet, Cleopatra the puppeteer, Egypt the enemy. And Rome listened, because Octavian didn't speak like a warlord, he spoke like a savior. While Antony raised legions in the east, Octavian rallied them in Italy. While Antony sailed with gold and elephants, Octavian sent scrolls and slogans. While Antony relied on force, Octavian used fear, not of battle, but of becoming something un-Roman. This wasn't just a fight for land, it was a fight for identity. And Octavian was winning. He had the Senate's backing, the people's trust, the legal claim, the cultural script, and he was about to bring it all to a head in a place called Actium. But before we go there, remember this. Rome didn't fall into monarchy because of ambition alone. It voted for it. Because when fear outweighs freedom and hope wears a uniform, the people won't just accept a ruler. They'll beg for one.
Actium, from dragon ships to thrones. September 2nd, 31 BCE. The Ionian Sea, a narrow strait off the coast of Greece. Two fleets face each other, their ships packed with thousands of men, tension heavy as the sea mist. One side sails under the banner of Rome, the other under the shadow of Egypt. This is not just a battle. It is the death rattle of the Republic. Mark Antony and Cleopatra command a vast eastern force, hundreds of ships, battle-tested soldiers, and the weight of dynasties. Their vessels are larger, more ornate, more symbolic. Cleopatra's flagship gleams with Egyptian gold and Phoenician sails. This is not just a military stand. It is a performance of power, meant to awe, to intimidate, to overwhelm. Octavian's fleet is smaller, leaner, but disciplined, and commanded by Marcus Agrippa, one of the finest naval strategists Rome had ever produced. He doesn't need to impress. He only needs to win. The battle begins. Antony's ships move slowly. Their size becomes a curse. They struggle to maneuver. Cleopatra, watching from the rear, waits. Perhaps she's unsure. Perhaps she's calculating. Perhaps she's already planning for escape. Then, the unthinkable. In the middle of the chaos, Cleopatra's ships turn and flee. Antony sees it and follows. His forces collapse. His men, abandoned and confused, surrender or die. The Eastern fleet disintegrates. The illusion of power, shattered in one afternoon. Actium isn't the bloodiest battle of the civil wars, but it is the most decisive. Because it is not just a defeat, it is a transition. Antony and Cleopatra flee to Egypt. For a year they hold out, trying to gather support, trying to revive something already dead. Octavian marches steadily behind them. Offers are made, refusals follow. There's no turning back. In August of 30 BCE, Octavian enters Alexandria. Antony, betrayed by false news of Cleopatra's death, falls on his sword. Cleopatra, after a final meeting with Octavian, takes her own life, perhaps by asp, perhaps by poison. The details are hazy, the symbolism eternal. With their deaths, the Republic officially ends, not because Octavian declared it, but because no one is left to stop him. He returns to Rome in triumph, not as a dictator, but as a restorer, not as a tyrant, but as a stabilizer. He rejects the title king. He doesn't call himself dictator. Instead, he chooses a new name, Augustus, the revered one. And Rome lets him, because the people are tired. The Senate is empty, the institutions hollow, and Augustus offers something they have not felt in decades: order. He keeps the Senate, but strips it of power. He keeps the laws, but controls their authors. He keeps the facade, but claims the core. And just like that, the Republic becomes the empire. Actium wasn't just the end of a war. It was the beginning of a myth, one where the people believed they had chosen their emperor, where power wore the robes of peace, and where the memory of Caesar lived on not in monuments, but in every corner of the Roman world. Because from this moment on, Caesar would no longer be a name. It would be a title.
Augustus, the first emperor who never called himself one. Actium had ended the wars. Antony and Cleopatra were gone. The Senate had no teeth. The Republic, once defined by competing voices and chaotic ambition, now had only one voice left: Octavian. But power, as Caesar had shown, is a dangerous thing to hold openly. Too much of it, and you get stabbed by 60 senators. Too little, and you lose control. Octavian had watched all of it: the rise, the betrayal, the blood on Pompey's statue. And he learned a lesson that would define the next 40 years. You can rule Rome, if you never make Rome admit it. How to rule without getting killed. Octavian didn't call himself king. That word was poison. He didn't declare himself dictator perpetuo like Caesar. That word meant death. Instead, he built a new kind of power: invisible, layered, unchallenged. He returned from Egypt not as a tyrant, but as a restorer of peace. He held a triumph, but then, surprise, he resigned, gave up all his powers, walked away from titles, let the Senate breathe. And they panicked. The Senate, terrified of being left to rule on their own, begged him to stay. So Octavian accepted, but only modest powers. They gave him control of the military provinces, a new name, Augustus, and a ceremonial role as first citizen, princeps. No crown, no throne, just total control hidden beneath republican ritual. Augustus understood image. He never made a decision alone, but always in consultation with the Senate. He didn't rule over the Senate. He ruled with it, on paper. In reality, no motion passed without his blessing. No general rose without his nod. No law moved unless he allowed it. He was careful, deliberate. Even his personal habits were curated to seem humble. He lived modestly, wore simple clothes, called himself father of the country, avoided opulence, let others call him divine after his death. He created a regime where no one felt conquered, just protected. And that was the brilliance. Caesar had died for holding too much power too obviously. Augustus held everything and made it look like a favor.
Restoring the Republic. Dream or deception? When Augustus stood before the Senate in 27 BCE and offered to return his powers, it wasn't an act of humility. It was the opening scene of a carefully choreographed performance, the greatest political theater in Roman history. He knew they would refuse, and they did, exactly as planned. What followed was not a restoration, it was a reinvention. The Republic wasn't reborn, it was rebranded. Augustus claimed to restore old traditions, but what he actually did was repurpose them. Every institution remained, but emptied of independence. Every office continued, but under his shadow. Every ritual was preserved, but carefully rewritten to center around him. He was not king. Rome hated kings, but he was something bigger than a consul, deeper than a dictator, and more permanent than any elected official. He held imperium maius, greater command over all provinces and armies. He held tribunician power for life, giving him the right to veto legislation, the right to propose laws, and legal immunity. He was Pontifex Maximus, the head of Roman religion, and all of it was legal, voted, applauded, celebrated. He didn't rule by fear, he ruled by consent, and that made him untouchable. Augustus understood something Caesar never did, that people don't fight tyranny when it comes wrapped in tradition. They embrace it, especially when it's quieter than the chaos it replaces. The Senate still met, but it only confirmed what Augustus already decided. Magistrates were still elected, but the real power lay with those Augustus endorsed. He didn't eliminate the Republic, he made it dependent on him to function. And to the people, this didn't feel like oppression, it felt like relief. For decades they had watched Rome tear itself apart: civil war, famine, debt, riots, foreign invasions. Now, finally, there was peace. The market stabilized, the grain ships arrived on time, veterans received land, temples were repaired, roads were built, the empire expanded. And for the first time in living memory, the Republic wasn't dying. It was just quiet. Was Augustus a tyrant? No. He was more dangerous. He was a solution. And to many Romans, that was enough. But not everyone was convinced. The older generation whispered. Men who remembered true Senate debates, veterans of earlier wars, they saw what had changed not in names, but in function. They knew the Republic was a shell. Still, they did nothing, because Augustus didn't give them a target, he gave them stability. And more than that, he gave them identity. He revived traditional Roman values: pietas, virtus, gravitas. He encouraged moral laws, promoted marriage, criminalized adultery. He positioned himself not just as a ruler, but as the moral center of Rome, a father figure. He said Rome had lost its way and that he was leading it back. In reality, he was leading it somewhere new, a world where one man embodied the state, where loyalty to Rome meant loyalty to Augustus, where history was curated, monuments spoke his name, and even the calendar revolved around his image. It worked because it was subtle. He didn't shout. He reshaped reality. He let poets call him a savior, let coins bear his face, let statues depict him as youthful and eternal. He censored nothing because everyone had already learned what to say. He made sure the next generation grew up in a world where the idea of republic still existed, but only in textbooks. This was his masterpiece. The restoration of the Republic wasn't a con. It was a mirror. He gave Rome back to the Romans, just small enough that they didn't notice it was in his hand.
The legacy of Augustus, mastering control through symbols. Augustus didn't conquer Rome with an army. He conquered it with meaning. Where Caesar had marched with legions, Augustus advanced with monuments. Where Sulla had ruled by proscriptions, Augustus ruled by presence. Everywhere, in everything, for everyone. Step into the forum, and his arch greeted you. Visit a temple, and his name was carved into the foundation. Listen to poets, and you heard his virtues immortalized in verse. Open your purse, and his image gleamed from every coin. This wasn't vanity, it was strategy. Augustus understood that to rule a people, you had to rule their stories. You had to shape what they remembered, what they celebrated, and what they feared. So he became not just a ruler, but a symbol. He rebuilt Rome, literally, After decades of ruin and fire, he restored temples, forums, aqueducts. But he didn't just restore infrastructure, he redefined what it meant to be Roman. He commissioned the Arapaces, the altar of peace, not to glorify war, but to enshrine its absence, a monument to the world he had created, fertile, orderly, pious. He encouraged art and architecture that celebrated harmony, lineage, and eternity. All roads might lead to Rome, but in Augustus's Rome, all narratives led to him. He surrounded himself with writers, Virgil, Horace, Livy, not as flatterers, but as craftsmen of a national myth. In the Aeneid, Virgil didn't just write a founding epic. He traced Augustus's lineage back to Aeneas, the Trojan hero who carried Rome's destiny on his shoulders. This was not history. This was sanctification. And it worked. Augustus became the model of Roman virtue, measured, calm, just, eternal. He didn't just unify the empire, he unified time. Under him, the calendar was reformed. The month of Sextilis was renamed Augustus, August. His name didn't just belong to politics, it belonged to eternity. But symbols, no matter how powerful, are fragile. Augustus knew that. He had no son. His designated heirs, Marcellus, Agrippa, Gaius, and Lucas, died young or disappointed. So he turned to Tiberius, his stepson, capable, dour, lacking charm, but obedient. And to prepare the people, Augustus didn't announce Tiberius as successor. He displayed him, gave him offices, gave him visibility, let Rome adjust, gradually, to the idea that power would flow within the family, not from the people. He wasn't creating a monarchy, he was just continuing the republic. When Augustus died in 14 CE, Rome didn't revolt, it wept. His funeral was vast, his body cremated, his spirit declared a god. And every emperor after him would bear the name Caesar Augustus, not just a name, but a template. Because Augustus didn't invent empire, he made it acceptable. He proved that power, when dressed in modesty and tradition, could last longer than any sword. He became the benchmark. Every strongman since, emperors, presidents, generals, has tried to do what Augustus did, hold absolute power in a world that still thinks it's free. And so his real legacy isn't monuments, it's the blueprint of how to control a republic by never making it realize it's gone.
The empire was stable, for now. Augustus had done the impossible. He ended civil war, preserved the illusion of a republic, and built the first true empire with no title of king. For 40 years, Rome knew peace, growth, and predictability. But Augustus was mortal, and legacy, no matter how carefully designed, is fragile. Because the moment a system depends on one man's balance, everything after him becomes an experiment. And Rome was about to meet its first test. Tiberius, from silent prince to political obsession. Tiberius wasn't born to rule. He was dutiful, trained, and competent, but never beloved. A general by profession, a stoic by temperament. Augustus adopted him not out of affection, but out of necessity. And when Augustus died, Tiberius didn't take the throne. He accepted responsibility. He addressed the Senate with careful language, declined too much honor,
asked for shared power. It looked like modesty. It wasn't. It was caution. Tiberius had lived through purges. He knew what too much power could trigger, so he moved slowly, maintained institutions, kept Augustus's name sacred, let the Senate speak until it disagreed. Then came the trials, and the treason laws, and the silence. Tiberius began to pull away from public life. Rome saw less of him. The Senate feared him. Letters replaced speeches. Informers replaced dialogue. Anyone could be accused of disloyalty, a joke, a poem, a dinner conversation. The city of marble became a city of whispers. Eventually, Tiberius left Rome altogether, retreating to the Isle of Capri. There, the rumors began. Tales of orgies, torture chambers, paranoia. Whether true or not, the message was clear. The emperor was absent, the fear was not. Rome functioned, but it no longer breathed. And when Tiberius died in 37 CE, the Senate exhaled. They thought the worst was over. They hadn't met his successor yet.
Caligula, when madness wears the crown. He was young, charismatic, handsome, the son of a beloved general. And when Tiberius died, the people cheered not just for a new emperor, but for a new beginning. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. But Rome knew him better by a nickname, Caligula, Little Boots, a childhood moniker from his days among the legions when he dressed in miniature armor beside his father, Germanicus. For the first few months, it felt like the dawn of something hopeful. He ended treason trials, paid off debts, restored exiles, hosted games, donated money. Even the Senate breathed easier. The Republic, they whispered, might finally find balance again. Then something changed. An illness, perhaps, a fever that nearly killed him. Or maybe the illness had always been there, hidden behind the smile. Whatever the cause, Caligula emerged from his sickbed, transformed. The man who had promised healing began to unravel. He didn't just demand loyalty, he demanded worship. He declared himself a living god, not in poetry or flattery, but in law. Statues of Zeus and Jupiter had their heads replaced with his. He built temples to himself, forced senators to grovel, appointed his horse Incitatus a priest, and allegedly planned to make it a consul. What began as eccentricity turned into performance, and then into cruelty. He mocked senators in public, slept with their wives, then discussed the details over dinner, executed on whims, bankrupted the treasury with lavish games, then taxed citizens to fund more games. He sailed to the ocean, declared war on Neptune, and ordered his troops to collect seashells as spoils of victory. Rome had faced tyrants before, but never like this, because Caligula wasn't interested in ruling. He wanted to dismantle dignity, to prove that no title, tradition, or office could restrain him. And everyone, senators, guards, priests, citizens, became actors in his grotesque theater. Yet no one dared oppose him. Why? Because even madness, when armed with legions, becomes invincible. Until one day, it didn't. In 41 CE, after less than 4 years on the throne, Caligula entered a hallway beneath the Palatine. There, members of the Praetorian Guard, men sworn to protect him, waited. They didn't protest. They didn't hesitate. They stabbed him again and again. His body was torn apart. His wife and daughter were murdered shortly after. The Senate tried to restore the Republic, They failed because the people didn't rise for liberty. They waited for another emperor, and they would get one. From the shadows of mockery came a surprise.
Claudius, the surprise of a fool. The palace was in chaos. Caligula was dead. The Senate scrambled to restore the Republic. The Praetorian Guard loomed over every decision. And deep within the imperial complex, behind a curtain, a middle-aged man was found cowering, shaking, stuttering, limping. Claudius. He wasn't supposed to be emperor. He wasn't even supposed to be taken seriously. He had grown up in the shadow of his family, nephew to Tiberius, uncle to Caligula, grandson of Mark Antony. But illness had marked him early, a limp, a stammer, nervous tics. In a society that worshipped poise and performance, Claudius was dismissed as weak, harmless, a scholar, a joke. His own family kept him hidden from public life, and that may have saved him. While others were assassinated, Claudius was ignored. But when the Praetorian Guard found him after Caligula's murder, terrified, trembling, they didn't kill him. They proclaimed him emperor. Why? Because he was a compromise, not too dangerous, not too ambitious, and most importantly, he owed his life to them. Claudius accepted, and the joke, Rome's idiot prince, became princeps. But he wasn't what anyone expected. Claudius may have been awkward, but he was no fool. Behind the stammer was a historian's mind, a policy wonk's obsession, and a survivor's instinct. He got to work. He professionalized the imperial bureaucracy, empowering freedmen and administrators to help run the vast empire. He reformed laws, expanded citizenship, improved the grain supply, built aqueducts, roads, and public buildings. And most boldly, he conquered Britain, a feat even Julius Caesar had failed to complete. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a message that the man no one had believed in could do what legends hadn't. But Claudius also understood power's fragility. He paid the Praetorian Guard well. He listened to Senate flattery. And he watched his own household with increasing paranoia. His personal life was a disaster. His wives were manipulative, especially Messalina, whose affairs and ambition humiliated him publicly. Eventually, he ordered her execution. He remarried, this time to Agrippina the Younger, his niece, a decision many saw as desperate, because Agrippina had a son, a teenage boy, and she wanted him to rule next. So Claudius adopted him, named him heir, and in 54 CE, after 13 years on the throne, Claudius fell ill. Poisoned, most believed, by mushrooms. His wife watched. Her son ascended, and Rome would never be the same again. Because Claudius, the accidental emperor, had cleared the path for a new kind of ruler. Not a scholar, not a soldier, but a performer, a firebrand, a boy named Nero.
Nero and the night Rome burned. Claudius had tried to govern with reason, but he died by poison, and in his place rose not a statesman, but a sensation. Nero, just 16 years old when he became emperor, adopted by Claudius, groomed by his mother Agrippina, a boy with poetry in his veins and a crown on his brow. The Senate saw a fresh start. Rome saw a golden prince. They didn't know yet that this was the beginning of one of the most infamous reigns in Roman history. Politics
art and manipulation. In the beginning, Nero played the part well. He gave generous handouts, held public games, reduced taxes, listened to advisors, especially the philosopher Seneca, who helped guide him with stoic wisdom, and the general Burrus, who managed the army's loyalty. He made speeches about restoring republican values. He portrayed himself as humble, artistic, sensitive. He opened theaters, sponsored poetry contests, wrote verses himself, sang, played the lyre. But behind the curtain, power was shifting. Because Nero didn't want to govern, he wanted to be adored. He saw himself not as a ruler, but as an artist king. And when admiration faded, he reached for control. It started with his mother. Agrippina had put him on the throne, pulled strings, expected obedience. But Nero, young, independent, adored, began to push back. She reminded him who he owed, so he reminded her who ruled. He stripped her of titles, removed her guards, publicly ignored her. When that didn't work, he ordered her death. Allegedly, his first attempt involved a self-sinking boat. She survived, so he sent men to finish the job. When they arrived, she met them with one legendary phrase, "Strike my womb first." She was killed, and Nero was free. From his mother, from any illusion of restraint. And slowly, the real Nero began to emerge. Not the poet, the puppet master.
Burning the city, arson or accusation. Rome burned for 9 days. It began on the night of July 18th, 64 CE, near the Circus Maximus. The wind fanned flames through narrow streets, wooden roofs, and crowded tenements. By the time it was over, 10 of the city's 14 districts were in ashes. Thousands were dead. Hundreds of thousands were homeless. It was the greatest urban disaster Rome had ever faced. And within days, all eyes turned to one man, Nero. He wasn't in Rome when the fire started. He was at his villa in Antium, but he returned quickly, organized relief efforts, opened his palaces to refugees, lowered grain prices, funded reconstruction. Still, rumors ignited faster than the flames had. Some said he had played music while the city burned. Others whispered he had ordered the fire himself to clear space for his grand new palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a sprawling complex of gardens, fountains, and gold-leafed ceilings. It didn't help that he seized large swaths of land afterward, land that had conveniently burned, or that his new construction plan demanded wide boulevards and fireproof materials, policies that sounded like preparation, or that his new palace would rise on the ruins of the old Forum. Was it true? Historians are still divided. Tacitus, writing decades later, said Nero likely didn't start the fire, but that he was blamed because of his reputation. Because by then, Nero had become something larger than a man. He was a symbol of excess, of ego, of empire unchecked. He sensed the danger and looked for a scapegoat. He found one in a small, new, unpopular sect, the Christians. They were strange. They didn't sacrifice to Roman gods. They met in secret. They spoke of a coming judgment. They refused to burn incense before the emperor's image. Nero accused them of arson, of hate against humanity,
of being enemies of Rome. And then came the punishment: crucifixions, executions, burnings in Nero's own gardens as human torches. It was the first recorded imperial persecution of Christians, and it worked temporarily. The anger shifted, the fear deepened, and Nero, he continued performing. But the fire had changed something, not just in the city, in him. He had tasted what it felt like to be blamed, to be vulnerable, and from that point on, Nero never trusted anyone again.
The end of a bloodline. Nero had ruled as an artist, as a tyrant, as a god. But even gods grow paranoid. In the years after the fire, Nero's grip on power tightened. His pleasures grew darker, his fears sharper. He executed rivals, former tutors, advisors, generals, even family. Anyone could be next. He had his wife Octavia executed, then married Poppaea Sabina, who later died, allegedly by a kick from Nero himself while she was pregnant. He blamed others, mourned publicly, married again, then again. One was a freedman, one was a boy. Nero dressed them both as wives. It was no longer government. It was performance art soaked in blood, and Rome was watching. The Senate grumbled. The army stirred. Governors in the provinces began whispering rebellion. In 68 CE, it began with Vindex, a governor in Gaul, who declared Nero unfit. Then Galba, in Spain, declared himself princeps. The legions backed him. Nero fled the city. Desperate, he begged for help. No one answered. The Praetorian Guard, once his shield, abandoned him. The Senate declared him a public enemy, and Nero ran to a villa outside Rome. There, surrounded by a few loyal freedmen, he asked someone to kill him. No one would. So trembling, bleeding, weeping, Nero took his own life. His final words, "Qualis artifex pereo," what an artist dies in me. He was 30 years old, and with him died the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the line that traced back to Augustus, to Julius Caesar, to the origins of the empire itself. Rome didn't rejoice. It hesitated, because while Nero had brought chaos, his death brought something more terrifying: uncertainty. Who would rule now? What came next? The Republic was long gone, but the empire, it was now up for grabs, and the chaos to come would make even Nero look stable.
The year of 4 emperors. Nero's death left a vacuum. Not a throne, not a title, a power void. And power, once unchained from law, becomes a prize for the boldest to seize. For the first time since Augustus, Rome had no heir, no dynasty, no plan. And in the chaos of that silence, 4 men, very different, equally ambitious, rushed forward. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian. Everyone wants the throne. Galba came first. An old senator, strict, humorless, respected by the aristocracy. He had rebelled against Nero and marched on Rome with the backing of the Spanish legions. The Senate confirmed him. He promised a return to order. He cut spending, refused bribes, executed rivals, and made enemies fast, especially among the Praetorian Guard, whom he had promised bonuses, then refused to pay.
Enter Otho, young, charming, indebted, once a friend of Nero, then an opportunist. He bribed the guard, promised gold, promised favors, and in January 69 CE, just weeks into Galba's reign, they turned on Galba in the Forum, beheaded him, and declared Otho emperor. The Senate, again, nodded. But elsewhere, another storm was brewing. Vitellius in Germany had been declared emperor by his legions before Galba even died. Slow-moving, indulgent, popular with the troops. As Otho tried to stabilize Rome, Vitellius's forces marched south. Otho met them in battle and lost. He killed himself soon after. Vitellius entered Rome in triumph. Lavish feasts, games, celebration. But he lacked discipline, drained the treasury, alienated allies. And in the east, another man had risen, Vespasian, a general, tough, experienced, commanding legions in Judea. He was no aristocrat, no poet, but he had the army and the patience to wait. As Rome tore itself apart, Vespasian built support, methodically. By December 69 CE, his forces entered the capital. Vitellius was dragged through the streets, killed. And for the fourth time that year, Rome had a new emperor. But this time, it had found something else too. A new kind of ruler.
From civil to military, who really chooses the emperor now? When Augustus ruled, he did so with the mask of the Republic. When Nero ruled, he held power through spectacle and inheritance. But after 69 CE, everything changed. Because for the first time, Rome's emperor wasn't chosen by the Senate, not by adoption, not by blood, but by legions. This was the lesson of the year of the four emperors. Whoever controls the army controls the empire. Galba was backed by Spanish troops, Otho by Praetorians, Vitellius by Rhine legions, Vespasian by Eastern legions and provincial governors. And the Senate? It merely ratified what soldiers had already decided. Rome's institutions still existed, but they no longer mattered. Loyalty wasn't to the state, it was to commanders. Ambitious generals understood this. They courted their troops with land promises, bonuses, shared plunder. They didn't govern the empire, they bargained for it. And the army learned something too, that it could make or break an emperor. Praetorians sold thrones. Provincial legions crowned candidates. The sword replaced the vote. The barracks replaced the forum. This shift didn't happen overnight, but 69 CE was the turning point. From here on, legitimacy wasn't a legal principle. It was a military fact. You weren't emperor because you were declared one. You were emperor because no one dared to disagree. And once power came through conquest, it had to be defended constantly. Revolts increased. Plots multiplied. Commanders feared their own men as much as their rivals. Because the army wasn't just a tool of policy anymore. It was the arbiter of power. And emperors, even strong ones, ruled at their mercy. Rome still had laws, but they were written with swords and signed in blood. The rise of the military empire. Vespasian didn't inherit an empire, he won it, and that changed everything. He wasn't born into the Julio-Claudian line. He didn't charm poets, he didn't sparkle at feasts. What he had was different. Grit, discipline, and the unsentimental loyalty of soldiers. And that's what Rome needed. After a year of chaos, Vespasian brought something rare, predictability. He paid the army, rebuilt the treasury, strengthened the provinces, restored stability. But make no mistake, his regime wasn't built on consensus. It was built on control. Vespasian kept the Senate, but only to approve what he'd already decided. He created a new bureaucracy, centralized power, put trusted men, often equestrians and career administrators, into key posts. He redefined what an emperor looked like. Not a prince, not a philosopher, but a general in command. He passed the role to his son, Titus, creating the Flavian dynasty. But even this inheritance now depended less on noble birth and more on the army's approval. From this point forward, Rome was an empire not of senators, but of soldiers. Legions became kingmakers, and emperors began to rule with one eye on the frontiers and the other on their own ranks. The shift was permanent. The Julio-Claudians had tried to rule with image, ideology, and legacy. The Flavians, and those who followed, would rule with boots and barracks. The empire became more professional, more efficient, and far more dangerous. Because now Rome wasn't led by its ideals. It was led by its military engine. And like any engine, when overdriven, underfunded, or turned inward, it could explode.
Pax Romana, or a storm waiting to break? Rome had survived the chaos. The emperors changed, the Senate bent, the legions chose. But for nearly 2 centuries, from Augustus to the Antonines, the empire didn't collapse. It expanded. It thrived. This era, historians would later call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But what kind of peace was it? Because peace is not the absence of noise. Sometimes it's just the sound of a bootstep. Order, law, and the power web. By the 2nd century CE, Rome controlled territory from the moors of Britannia to the deserts of Arabia, from the Rhine to the Nile. Nearly 1/4 of the world's population lived under Roman rule. And to manage that, Rome didn't rely on gods or myths. It relied on systems. First came law. Roman law wasn't just a tool of punishment. It was a blueprint of society. Codified rules, courts, contracts, citizenship tiers. A Roman in Syria could appeal to the emperor. A merchant in Gaul had legal protections. A land dispute in Egypt could cite precedents set in Rome. This legal web gave the empire coherence. Then came infrastructure. Roads, bridges, aqueducts, harbors. More than 400,000 kilometers of roads stitched the empire together. Messages moved fast. Troops moved faster. If there was a revolt, a legion could be at the gates within weeks. The empire wasn't just vast, it was connected. But structure alone doesn't hold power. People do. And at the center of this power web stood the emperor. Not a king in name, but in function. He was the apex of a pyramid. Below him, a network of governors, prefects, tax officials, military commanders, all reporting upward. Loyalty flowed not through ideology, but through patronage, favors, appointments, access, and fear. Because while Rome prized stability, it feared independence. Governors were rotated frequently. Successful generals were recalled. No one was allowed to build their own empire within the empire. The goal was unity, but the method was control. Even the citizenship system reinforced hierarchy. True Roman citizenship came with rights, protection from torture, legal appeal, land ownership. But most of the empire lived as peregrini, non-citizens, subject to taxes, drafts, obedience. Over time, citizenship was extended for loyalty, for service, for usefulness, but always as a tool, not a right. And yet, for all this hierarchy, for all this control, life under Rome could be remarkably predictable. Cities flourished, trade boomed, local elites were absorbed into Roman culture, granted titles, roles, even places in the Senate. In return, they kept the peace in the provinces. It wasn't equality, It was a deal. Order in exchange for submission. Law in exchange for loyalty. Peace in exchange for silence. And for many, it was worth it. Because under Roman rule, you could farm without fear of raids. You could travel from Africa to Spain under imperial protection. You could worship your gods, so long as you didn't defy the emperor. To the world, Rome offered something rare, predictable power. But beneath that surface, there were cracks.
Tax systems, population, and provincial management. The Roman Empire was not held together by flags or statues. It was held together by resources. And the key to resources? Taxation. Rome's power didn't just march on sandals, it marched on revenue. To keep roads paved, legions fed, aqueducts flowing, temples repaired, governors paid, and borders secure, the empire needed money. Vast, regular, reliable sums of it. And that money came from the provinces. At the core was the tributum, a land and poll tax imposed on non-citizens. Citizens were largely exempt, especially in Italy. But outside the core, the system was complex and heavy. There were taxes on crops, on inheritances, on property transfers, harbor fees, customs duties, temple contributions, and, in emergencies, special levies. Collection varied by region. Some provinces used publicani, private tax contractors. Others relied on local magistrates. But the effect was often the same: pressure, abuse, arbitrary enforcement. The emperor demanded stability. The provinces had to deliver. And if they didn't, legions were never far behind. To maintain this system, Rome needed more than tax codes. It needed data. So came the census. Every 5 years in Rome, less regular in the provinces, but always looming. Households were counted, livestock tallied, land measured. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was visibility. Rome wanted to know who owed what and how much they could extract before breaking the system. Because under the Pax Romana, peace didn't mean equality. It meant efficiency. The provinces were managed not for autonomy, but for output. Governors were appointed not just to rule, but to extract. They had military and judicial authority, but their performance was judged in numbers: grain shipments, tax revenue, order maintained. They stayed for limited terms, but the consequences of misrule could last generations. Some governors tried to build trust. They funded local projects, patronized temples, married into local elites. Others ruled with an iron hand. The difference often depended less on imperial policy and more on personality. Because Rome was too big to micromanage, it governed through expectations. Keep the grain flowing from Egypt. Keep the silver moving from Spain. Keep the soldiers recruited from the Balkans. And in return, you kept your job, maybe earned a triumph, maybe a statue, maybe even a seat in the Senate. But failure? Failure meant recall, or disgrace, or death. And so a quiet tension underpinned the entire system. The empire functioned beautifully from a distance. But at the village level, it often felt like pressure without mercy. Because the roads that brought Roman goods also brought Roman taxes. The laws that promised fairness also demanded tribute. And the peace that Rome bragged about? It was expensive. But for all its harshness, the system worked. Grain flowed, wealth grew, cities thrived. For now. Peace by force. What was simmering beneath? To the casual eye, the Roman Empire during the Pax Romana looked unshakable. There were no major civil wars, no widespread famines. The roads were patrolled, the provinces managed, the frontiers fortified.
Grain arrived, gold flowed, games were staged. Emperors came and went with rituals, not revolts. But look closer, and the cracks start to show. Because this peace wasn't passive, it was imposed. And anything imposed must be enforced. At its core, the Pax Romana was built on military pressure. Rome had more than 24 standing legions stationed across the empire, from the Rhine to the Euphrates. They weren't just border guards. They were symbols of presence, of punishment, of what happened if you resisted. Uprisings did happen. In Gaul, in Judea, in North Africa. And when they did, Rome responded with speed and severity. Rebellions weren't negotiated. They were crushed. Cities razed. Populations enslaved. Leaders executed. Peace, in Roman terms, didn't mean harmony. It meant silence after force. And the cost of maintaining that silence was rising. The army needed constant funding. The bureaucracy expanded. The emperors grew increasingly paranoid, not of foreign enemies, but of internal collapse. Because Rome didn't fear invasion, it feared itself. Feared that another general might declare himself emperor, that the Praetorian Guard might switch loyalties, that governors might hoard grain or gold. And so trust eroded, surveillance increased, punishments grew harsher, and all the while, the people, especially in the provinces, watched. They paid their taxes, saluted the eagle, but beneath the obedience was a question. What are we loyal to? To Rome? To the emperor? To the law? Or just to the fear of what happens if we aren't? Even in the heart of Rome, anxiety simmered. The emperors built bigger palaces, held grander games, expanded the welfare system, but none of it addressed the root issue, that the Pax Romana wasn't a piece of mutual trust. It was a piece of managed force. And force, no matter how efficient, can only hold so long. Because when loyalty is rented, when identity is imposed, when silence is enforced, then all it takes is one crack, one economic crisis, one succession dispute, one frontier breach, and the whole machine begins to shudder. It hadn't happened yet, but it would. Soon. The final cracks. Rome had weathered invasions. It had survived assassinations, civil wars, and mad emperors. But by the 3rd century CE, the empire faced a different kind of enemy. Decay from within. Not loud, not theatrical, but constant. Economic decline, inflation, and social instability. For centuries, Rome had lived off expansion. Conquered lands brought gold, slaves, tribute. Each new province meant more revenue, more spoils, more glory. But by the 200 CE, there was little left to conquer. The borders were drawn. And suddenly, the machine had to run on maintenance, not momentum. The costs didn't shrink, they grew. More soldiers were needed to guard the frontiers, more administrators to manage bureaucracy, more grain to feed growing cities. But the inflow of wealth had slowed, and Rome didn't adjust. It debased its currency. Silver coins were mixed with cheaper metals. Values dropped, prices rose, trust collapsed. Merchants raised rates. Salaries lost meaning. Barter returned in many regions, and with inflation came inequality. The rich found ways to shield their wealth, land, villas, influence. The poor? They starved. Urban unrest grew. Rural populations declined. Cities shrank.
Abandoned buildings, collapsing infrastructure, waves of internal migration. To fix it, the state taxed harder, pressed the landowners, pressed the peasants, pressed everyone, except those with enough power to evade. Tax collectors became feared more than bandits. And as the state's grip tightened, its legitimacy frayed. Rome was no longer the bringer of law and order. It was a burden. In the provinces, loyalty became thinner. In the army, loyalty became for sale. Legions weren't just protecting the empire. They were choosing emperors again. Between 235 and 284 CE, Rome had over 25 emperors. Many ruled for less than a year. Most died violently. The empire didn't fall, it spasmed. And underneath it all, the economy kept bleeding. The Pax Romana was over, and in its place stood a hollowed empire, still large, still proud, but beginning to realize that peace built on power cannot survive without purpose.
Christianity, Diocletian, and the last-ditch reforms. As the empire fractured economically, a new idea was rising. Quietly at first, then with fire, then uncontainably. Christianity. It had begun as a persecuted sect, mocked, feared, repressed. But by the 3rd century, it had grown beyond control. Because Rome had built an empire of roads and cities and trade. And ideas travel, especially ideas that promise hope where the state brings only burden. Christianity spread through soldiers, merchants, slaves, housewives. It didn't require temples. It didn't require citizenship. It offered a kingdom not of this world, a promise beyond taxes, a loyalty beyond emperors. And Rome saw it as a threat, because the empire didn't care who you worshipped so long as you acknowledged Caesar. Christians wouldn't. They refused sacrifice, refused imperial cult, and that made them dangerous. Emperor after emperor tried to contain the movement. Some ignored it, some punished it. Then came Diocletian, a soldier emperor, a reformer, a planner. He didn't want to persecute. He wanted to save Rome. But to save it, he had to redefine it. He saw the chaos, the inflation, the military coups, the spiritual drift. And he responded with something no Roman had dared before: reinvention. He divided the empire into East and West, appointed co-emperors, 2 Augusti, 2 Caesars, created the Tetrarchy, rule of 4. Each man governed a region. Each had his own court, army, capital. Unity was gone, but function remained. He standardized prices, froze wages, issued an edict on maximum prices. It failed, but the attempt was bold. He restructured the army, increased bureaucracy, made loyalty to the emperor a sacred duty. And then he turned on Christianity. In 303 CE, Diocletian launched the Great Persecution. Churches destroyed, scriptures burned, clergy imprisoned, Christians tortured, executed, hunted. The goal? To restore Roman unity through purity, to eliminate what the gods disapproved, to reclaim the old rights, old strength, old certainty. But the world had changed, and the persecution didn't break Christianity. It amplified it. Martyrs inspired converts. Blood became scripture. Faith hardened. And Rome, instead of reclaiming control, found itself fighting a new Rome rising inside its borders. Diocletian had tried to freeze an empire in time, but history, like belief, moves forward. And soon, even emperors would kneel.
Splitting the empire, the beginning of the end. Diocletian had tried to govern an empire too big to manage. His solution? Cut it in half. Not in defeat, but in design. The empire was simply too vast, too many frontiers, too many threats, too many needs. No single ruler could respond to everything at once. So in 285 CE, Diocletian took the unprecedented step of creating a formal division, East and West, each with its own emperor, its own capital, its own bureaucracy. Still loyal in theory, still Roman, but in practice, two empires were being born. The East, Greek-speaking, wealthier, more urban, anchored by cities like Antioch, Alexandria, and eventually Constantinople. The West, Latin-speaking, rural, under pressure from Germanic tribes, plagued by fading infrastructure and brittle loyalties. At first, the split seemed smart. It allowed quicker decisions, better defense, more focused governance. But over time, it exposed something deeper, that unity had already been a myth, culturally, economically, religiously. The two halves of the empire were drifting apart. And when Diocletian retired in 305 CE, voluntarily, shockingly, his system fell into chaos. The tetrarchy collapsed into civil war, multiple claimants, shifting alliances, another cycle of blood and bargaining, until one man rose to power, Constantine. He reunified the empire, briefly. He embraced Christianity, decisively. He moved the capital from Rome to Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople. But even Constantine couldn't reverse the tide. After his death, the empire fractured again. And this time, the split was permanent. The East became the Byzantine Empire. It would endure for nearly 1,000 more years. But the West? It faltered. One emperor after another. One invasion after another. Rome, once the heart of the world, became a memory. And in 476 CE, when the last Western emperor was deposed, no armies marched, no gods wept. Because Rome hadn't fallen in a single night. It had drifted away from within, split by design, broken by time, replaced by something new. And in that silence, the world entered a different age, the Middle Ages. But echoes of Rome would remain, in law, in language, in legend, in every empire that followed, each claiming to be the new Rome. But there was only one, and its ending began the moment it split.
When Rome was no longer Rome. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was still standing, but only just. The economy was brittle, the army was stretched, the bureaucracy bloated, the emperors weak, disposable, often puppets of generals or foreign mercenaries. Rome, once a conqueror of worlds, now bribed tribes not to invade. And even that stopped working. The Goths, the Vandals, and the final blows. The cracks had been forming for centuries. Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, had long pressed against Rome's frontiers. Sometimes they raided, sometimes they were hired, sometimes they were invited in. But in 376 CE, something changed. A massive group of Visigoths fleeing the Huns begged entry into the empire. Rome allowed it, but treated them like animals. Abused, starved, extorted. 2 years later, the Visigoths rebelled. In 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, they crushed a Roman army and killed Emperor Valens. It was a catastrophe and a warning. But Rome didn't listen. The empire kept fragmenting. Local rulers gained more power. Loyalty turned regional. And then, in 410 CE, came the unthinkable. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, sacked Rome, the eternal city, the symbol of empire, of order, of the gods, pillaged, desecrated. For 3 days, Rome, untouched by enemies for 800 years, was ravaged. The psychological blow was immense. The empire staggered on, but the magic was broken. In 455 CE, the Vandals crossed from North Africa. They sacked Rome again, this time worse. Even the word vandalism comes from this moment. Then came the death blow. In 476 CE, the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus. No battle, no bloodbath, just resignation. The Senate sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, and that was that. The Western Roman Empire was gone, but the East, still alive, still calling itself Roman. But the Rome of Augustus, of Caesar, of Cicero was gone, burned, fragmented, and fading into history. Rome has fallen, or just changed its clothes. 476 CE, that's the date carved into textbooks, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But history is rarely that clean. Rome didn't vanish, it morphed. Because even after the emperors were gone, the idea of Rome remained. The Senate still met, ceremonially. Roman law continued in adapted forms. Latin still governed contracts, church texts, intellectual life. More importantly, the infrastructure Rome had built, roads, aqueducts, cities, still framed the map of Europe. The new rulers, they didn't tear it all down, they moved in. The Visigoths in Gaul and Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Vandals in North Africa. They wore Roman clothing, minted Roman-style coins, adopted Roman titles. Many converted to Christianity. And that was the real transformation. Rome didn't fall, it became Christian. The empire that once crucified followers of Christ had, by the 4th century, made Christianity its state religion. And with the fall of the West, the Church stepped into the vacuum. Bishops became civic leaders. The Pope became a new kind of Roman emperor, one of souls, not legions. And in the East, the empire survived. As the Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, speaking Greek, ruled by emperors who still called themselves Caesars. They kept Roman law, Roman bureaucracy, Roman military structures for another 1,000 years. So what really fell? Not Rome's language, not Rome's systems. What fell was the illusion that a single city, a single emperor, a single army could hold the center. What replaced it was a network of kingdoms, of churches, of memories. And that memory of Rome, of law, of empire would shape Europe long after the last eagle standard disappeared. Rome didn't fall in a moment. It became the soil of what came next. The legacy, still alive in law, language, and toilets. Rome fell, but Rome never left. Because long after the legions disappeared, Rome remained in the details, in how we build cities, in how we name our months, in how we think about law, rights, infrastructure, even plumbing. Yes, plumbing. Because the Romans didn't just conquer the world, they connected it. They built roads straighter than modern highways, aqueducts that moved water across mountains, sewers that drained cities of millions, public toilets, central heating, glass windows, concrete. Much of it lost and later rediscovered, but the template never vanished. Law? Our modern systems, from France to Brazil, from Louisiana to Italy, trace their roots to Roman civil law. The idea that law is written,
that contracts matter, that citizenship grants rights, that justice follows precedent. It all came from Roman jurisprudence. Language? Latin may no longer be spoken, but it echoes everywhere. Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, they're all daughter languages of Rome. Even English, though Germanic, is half built on Latin roots. When we talk of justice, university, senate, military, civilization, we speak Rome. Even the way we tell time, January named for Janus, March for Mars, July for Julius, August for Augustus. The calendar we live by, Roman. The idea of the republic, Roman. The concept of citizenship as a civic identity, Roman. Architecture, domes, arches, colonnades. Every courthouse, every Capitol building, every marble monument you see in Washington or Paris, Rome. Even the concept of a state religion, and later the separation of church and state, evolved from Roman experiments in belief and authority. And then, yes, the toilets. Because the Romans didn't see infrastructure as luxury. They saw it as identity. An empire that built for the future, even when the future forgot who had laid the stones. Rome's legacy isn't just in ruins. It's in how we think, how we organize, how we imagine power. It was a world that rose from marshes, became a republic, then an empire, then a memory, and now a foundation. You can tear down an empire, but you can't unwrite its story. And Rome wrote in stone.
Well, you made it. From mosquito swamps and wolf milk twins, to emperors setting fires, senators throwing chairs, and a city that ruled the world, then forgot how to rule itself. If Rome has taught us anything, it's this. Power is messy, glory is loud, and plumbing weirdly important. You've walked through 1,200 years of ambition, blood, betrayal, and, somehow, public baths. Not bad for a bedtime story. So, if your eyes are heavy now, that's okay. You've carried an empire, twice. Let history rest beside you tonight, not as a dusty lesson, but as a reminder. The world is always changing, and always kind of the same. Good night, fellow time traveler. Thanks for sticking around till the fall of Rome and beyond. And if you hear whispers in your dreams, don't worry. It's probably just Cicero, still talking. Sleep well. You've earned it.